Hey NBC Youth, it's crazy. We're coming to the end of so many things at the moment. Mission Month ends this week. We finish Mark's Gospel this week, and it's Easter this weekend. So big things are happening. I hope you're excited. I know I'm excited. I wanted to talk to you about what we've read this week in Mark and what we're going to read as we come into Easter this week. And fortunately, in God's timing, we're reading about the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus as we're celebrating the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. So that's always exciting when those things line up like that. I thought I would start, we didn't have any questions this week, so I thought I would start by looking at two really important figures in the Gospel of Mark. The first one is the Roman centurion who actually puts Jesus on the cross. Because we're told in chapter 15, verse 39, that he is the first person who really understands who Jesus is in the Gospel. Because remember, there's this confusion. Jesus says he is the king, but right now he's wearing a crown of thorns and he's bleeding, so he doesn't look like a king even though he says he's the king. And he's about to be crucified, and when he's hanging up on the cross, the Roman centurion actually understands who Jesus really is. Have a look at chapter 15, verse 39. When the centurion, who stood facing him, saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was the Son of God." So this is a really pivotal point, because this foreigner, this Roman centurion who actually crucifies people for a living, he is the first person in Mark's whole gospel who truly understands who Jesus is. Jesus is the suffering servant. Jesus is the crucified king. He is the king who dies for his people. Remember back in chapter 10 we were told that Jesus lays his life down as a ransom for many. And so Jesus is the king who suffers for his people. He's the king who goes to the cross. So the other people that I want to look at, and this is the second half of our readings this week, is Mary Magdalene and some of the other women. We're told in chapter 15, verse 40, that they were there and they watched Jesus be crucified. Jesus was taken down from the cross. He was put into a tomb by a guy called Joseph. And after a few days, the women came to anoint his body with spices at the start of chapter 16. And when they're standing, they come to the tomb and they're thinking to themselves, how are we going to roll this stone away that's blocking the tomb? And when they get to the tomb, they see the stone's not there. They see a man who's sitting inside who looks like an angel. He probably is an angel. And they're told that Jesus has risen from the dead. And what's really odd is verse 8 of chapter 16. And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And that's where the gospel ends. That's the last bit. You might have in your Bibles a bit afterwards that says some of the earliest manuscripts do not include verse 9 to verse 20. What that essentially means is that Mark didn't write verse 9 to verse 20. Somebody added that in later because they were confused by the way that Mark ended the gospel. I know there's going to be heaps of questions about that, so just a few things that I wanted to say about the end of Mark's gospel. Firstly, you need to understand that when the Bible was put together, they used a whole bunch of different manuscripts. 99% of the manuscripts were exactly the same. Probably 99.9% of the manuscripts. There's two places in the New Testament where you have a big chunk that they disagree about. There's quite a few places where they disagree about a word here or there, but there's two places in the New Testament where there's a big chunk they disagree about. The end of Mark's Gospel and John chapter 8, there's a story in there that they're not sure is original. And essentially what it means that it wasn't in the earliest manuscripts is it means that it probably wasn't written by the early authors. It was probably added later as a way to make sense of some of the stuff that was happening. So this last section of Mark's Gospel, people disagree about it, but I personally think that it actually wasn't written by Mark, and it shouldn't be in your Bibles. There are some people who are confused by the end of Mark's Gospel. They think to themselves, well, maybe the end of it was lost, like we lost it early on, it got cut off and it never got replaced. Or maybe Mark never got around to finishing the gospel. But personally, I think that Mark does finish the gospel, and the way that he finishes the gospel is by showing you that you can see Jesus crucified on the cross, just like these women did, and you can see him resurrected from the dead, and you can come to the wrong conclusion, which is to be afraid and to run away. But rather than following the example of these women, we are meant to follow the example of the centurion, who, when he saw Jesus on the cross, he realized that that is the suffering servant for us, and said, truly this man is the Son of God. And so I think that Mark actually intentionally finishes his gospel with this because it challenges us to think about our response to Jesus' death and resurrection.